What would you do if a new moon appeared in Earth's sky overnight? Not a rock, not a satellite, but a structure alive with impossible gravity, rewriting tides, tearing storms across the planet, and threatening to crack continents apart. Nations argue whether to worship it, weaponize it, or destroy it. While inside, astronauts discover it is no machine, but an intelligence older than history itself. One mistake could shatter Earth. One wrong choice could end humanity. And in the silence above, the phantom waits for our answer. Join us as we descend into its core, where survival and identity will be tested against the weight of worlds. Section 1. The impossible second moon. No warning preceded the event. No collision alerts screamed through the orbital networks, and no satellite feeds recorded an approach from deep space. Yet when dawn reached the Pacific Rim on that morning, humanity looked upward and saw not one moon but two. The new arrival hung in the sky like a mirror carved from void, smooth, silver-hued, and far too perfect in its curvature. A sphere so flawless that even amateur astronomers could see no shadows or craters upon its skin. At first it appeared a trick of atmosphere, some mirage stitched across the horizon. But within hours, every observatory confirmed the impossible truth. A second moon now orbited Earth. Panic and awe rippled across the globe. Some citizens knelt in reverence, whispering that it was the return of divine prophecy, while others filled the streets, demanding governments strike it from the heavens before it unveiled intent. Weather satellites traced strange anomalies almost immediately, tides surging several meters beyond predictions, currents twisting in violent gyres that devoured coastal villages before emergency systems could be deployed. Storms bloomed across the equator, patterns out of step with established climatology, as though Earth's atmosphere had been nudged by invisible hands. In the halls of power, confusion hardened into arguments. Defense ministries demanded nuclear readiness, yet no trajectory data could explain how a body of such size had arrived without detection. Astrophysicists pointed to the object's orbit already stabilized in resonance with Earth's rotation, an insertion so precise it mocked the idea of chance. Journalists branded it the Phantom Moon, a name that captured both the mystery and the dread that had begun to coil through every conversation on the planet. In orbit, aboard the United Terran ship Dauntless, Captain Mara Elin stood before a viewing port as the Phantom's silver arc loomed above Earth's shadow line, reflecting the sun with unnatural brilliance. Around her, the command theater held its breath, waiting for her reaction. She did not speak of war or of miracles. She simply muttered, almost to herself, that nothing this deliberate ever arrived without purpose, and that purpose rarely ended in peace. Please do press that like button if you have enjoyed this story so far. That would mean a lot to me. Now back to the story. Section 2. Orders in the Quiet Storm. Emergency directives rippled outward in encrypted bursts while the Phantom Moon continued its silent pull upon Earth's tides. And within hours, the task of selecting a crew for the first expedition became less about expertise than about representation, because no government wished to be absent from history's next chapter. The roster shifted 3 times before final clearance arrived, and when it did, Captain Mara Elin received the list without comment, then read each name aloud in the Dauntless Command Theater as if reciting vows before witnesses. Ria Okiye, gravitational cartographer, carried with her simulations already unraveling in the face of anomalies. Jules Hahn, veteran pilot, showed a calm steadiness sharpened by decades of threading impossible burns. Pavel Ibarra, oceanographer recruited for tidal expertise, smelled faintly of salt and ozone as though the sea clung to him. And Anika Vor, system specialist, masked her unease by folding her hands together as if quiet discipline could suppress tremors. Launch rose through atmosphere on the thinnest flame, engines whispering rather than roaring, as though restraint itself would earn favor from whatever intelligence had delivered the moon. Below them, Earth's oceans glittered, familiar yet fragile beneath a new satellite whose sudden presence had already twisted coastlines with premature surges. Ahead, the phantom moon swelled against the canopy, its surface too flawless for geology, too muted for alloy, as if it had been grown rather than built, sculpted into perfection by design rather than accident. The crew fell into silence, their voices absorbed by the cabin glow, while Mission Control offered updates in tones that sounded more like prayers than orders. Telemetry spread across their screens, petals of data folding over one another in restless bloom. Ria whispered that gravitational gradients behaved as though valleys had become ridges and ridges had collapsed into basins, inverted bowls etched into space-time itself. Pavel muttered about harbors already reporting out-of-sequence surges, and his tone placed fishing villages, estuaries, and breakwaters into the cabin beside them. Mara ordered active scans disabled and passive sensors extended, reasoning that anything able to arrive unseen deserved courtesy rather than aggression. As Dauntless crossed into shadow, the limb of the new moon sliced starlight with surgical precision, a horizon too clean for randomness. Microprobes were dispatched, drifting outward like seeds carried on wind, their transmission steady until, one by one, they dimmed into silence. Not destruction, not interference, but refusal, as though the object itself had chosen not to acknowledge their knock. Anika's voice steadied the cabin with the explanation, not jamming, but invitation withheld. The absence resonated louder than any alarm. Mara clasped her hands behind her back and spoke evenly, commanding Ria to map the moon's interior not with signals, but with gravity's own language. If silence was the tongue of the phantom moon, then they would learn to listen until it spoke back. If you have enjoyed this story so far, then please do subscribe and hit the bell icon to listen to more stories like this one. Let's get back to the story now. Section 3. Gravity finds the door. Ria's passive gravimetry painted a veil of motion across the phantom moon's canopy, not chaotic or random, but deliberate, as though the very field lines themselves were breathing in rhythm with something beneath the surface. Valleys bent upward while ridges collapsed downward, curves that seemed to contradict one another, yet always resolved into balance. The way a tide seems lawless until seen across the sweep of a planet's oceans. The numbers flickered on her display like a whisper too careful to speak aloud, but every rise and fall carried the weight of intention. It was not geology, it was pulse. Mara ordered the Ria into a slow drift, thrusters trimmed to near silence, and reactor hum muffled, until only inertia carried them forward. Joules adjusted with delicate bursts, hands steady as if trimming a sailboat on a windless sea. For several long minutes, the void remained empty of anything but distorted echoes, and then near the terminator a shimmer began. Not light in any visible spectrum, but certainty, a distortion that clung to the edges of every reading like the outline of a door. Anika ran her simplest harmonic routine, expecting nothing, yet the model produced an ellipsis that spiraled in time with Earth's tides, tightening with each coastal surge and loosening with each retreat. Her voice was hushed as she explained that the ocean itself was the key, gravity's slow hands knocking against a lock sculpted to respond only to the turning of the world. Pavel leaned forward at once, pointing out the phase lag in shoreline telemetry and noting that it matched exactly the travel time of gravity between Earth and its ghostly new neighbor. If the door existed, it was the sea itself that held the handle. Mara gave the order none of them expected. No thrust, no correction, only silence. Ria synchronized sensors with the rhythm of the tides. Anika set the ship's internal systems into a metronome of stillness. And for a heartbeat, the Ria felt less like a vessel than an offering. The field brightened. Gravity lifted the hull with the subtlety of a hand cupping water, and without movement, the ship slipped forward, falling into a place that had been waiting. The canopy gave way like glass, folding inward, and suddenly they were beneath it. Black ribs arched across the sky that was no sky, auroral veils curling in the heart of an impossible sphere, as though the entire interior of the phantom moon had been hollowed into a cathedral built not of matter, but of gravity itself. Instruments stuttered, reporting weight heavier than iron yet lighter than vacuum, while probes chirped with timestamps that wandered as if time had found a new ocean and was learning to ebb. Section 4. The Inverted Cathedral. They drifted slowly past the threshold and entered a world that inverted every expectation of natural order. Because the phantom moon's interior was not a hollow cavern in the ordinary sense, but a cathedral of reverse space, an entire sphere turned inside out where ground and sky had traded roles and rivers of luminous gravity wound their way across walls like veins of liquid light. The crew found themselves staring upward at what should have been a ceiling, yet stretched into an infinite landscape wrapped above their heads. Continents of crystal and shadow forming an arch that enclosed them like the ribs of some ancient leviathan. Captain Mara held the ship steady on the faintest of thruster trims, unwilling to disturb currents that seemed less like atmosphere and more like fields woven into fabric, every vector a stitch pulling them deeper toward unseen intention. Commander Jules whispered telemetry that contradicted itself, gravity drawing sideways one moment and downward the next, while Pavel muttered that the great black spars stretching across the sphere were not random ridges, but resonant conduits, waveguides capable of carrying entire symphonies of force around the inner shell. He suggested that if struck with the correct harmonic, the entire moon could answer like an instrument, not in sound but in orchestrated falling. Rhea deployed sensor pods tethered on whisper-thin filaments, each thread quivering as sympathetic resonances pulsed through them. The readings defied standard metrics. Time itself wavered in oscillation while distances argued against their own rulers. Yet through contradiction, a pattern emerged, as though the interior was less a place of matter and more a body whose heart still beat. Across the far hemisphere, half-veiled in auroral haze, rose a leaf-shaped continent of force, its spine studded with nodes that pulsed in careful rhythm, interlacing until the whole lattice seemed to breathe with ponderous patience. As they drew near that continent of light, the background chaos of conflicting pulls began to soften, replaced by a rhythm too ordered to be chance. On the canopy, tracery bloomed like frost, though no crystal could ever etch such deliberate geometry. The patterns formed notation rather than decoration, sequences of gradients that hinted at a grammar beyond human language, a score written directly into the senses. Anika traced the fields with nervous algorithms that immediately rewrote themselves in reply, as if the cathedral preferred being understood as rhythm rather than diagram. Something vast turned within that silence. Not mass or machine, but awareness, subtle yet undeniable, rolling in its sleep and brushing the hull with gentle vectors that felt like fingers pushing them toward an unseen pole. Mara gripped the rail as realization bled through her bones. This was no ruin, no derelict shell, but a listening organ starved for centuries of Earth's voice, an intelligence that had waited for their arrival as though expecting a familiar song. "Record everything," she whispered, and though her words were quiet, the phantom moon folded them seamlessly into its resonance, carrying them outward like notes in a rising hymn, as if the cathedral itself had decided that humanity's presence was the next measure in its unfinished score. Section 5. Tides that break nations. On Earth, the consequences of the phantom moon's pulse reached not through poetry, but through the marrow of daily life, because the gravitational anomalies that had first nudged coastlines now gathered into convulsions, tides rising not by meters, but by cities, surging inland across deltas and swallowing entire ports before retreating in sudden collapse that tore bridges from their foundations. Seismographs across the Pacific Rim burned red with tremors that did not come from fault lines, but from unseen levers in orbit, as though the phantom moon's breath alone was enough to twist the bones of continents. Governments met in frantic sessions, their communiques overlapping like storms, some demanding immediate strikes to shatter the satellite before the next tide could drown another shore, others urging restraint out of fear that any violent response would collapse the moon inward and unleash a detonation large enough to peel Earth's atmosphere into space. Across the fractured voices, nations turned upon one another, accusations hurled that one bloc or another had secretly engineered the construct as a weapon. Satellite networks filled with speculation and fury, every broadcast framed as certainty, every certainty sharpened into division. From orbit, Vigilant relayed images of drowned cities, skyscrapers reduced to blackened candles, surrounded by oceans that did not belong there. And Mara's voice caught against her will as she acknowledged that they were witnessing not invasion, but coercion, a reminder that Earth was fragile and would remain fragile until it understood what the Phantom Moon wanted. Jules reported that communications were fraying into sabotage, fleets refusing to share data, and military beacons jamming corridors that should have remained open. Humanity, instead of uniting against a silent leviathan above, was splintering into suspicion, feeding the storm already tearing at the planet's foundations. Yet within the chamber of Vigilant, the crew pressed closer together, driven less by command and more by the knowledge that hesitation only deepened the wound. Rhea traced harmonic resonances in the ship's archives, overlaying them against the tide's rhythms, and announced with grim certainty that the anomalies were not random, but pulses, deliberate and timed like messages tapping against Earth's crust. Anika's algorithms, trembling with contradiction, confirmed that the pattern was not geological but linguistic, a warning written in the language of oceans and earthquakes. Captain Mara tightened her grip on the command rail, her eyes hard but haunted, because she knew the truth now. The Phantom Moon was not a passive relic, but an intelligence whose first words had been carved into the shorelines of Earth, and those words carried both promise and threat. Section 6. The Pulse of Memory. The Phantom Moon's surface did not simply shine with reflected sunlight, but seemed to inhale light, bending it inward toward fractures that pulsed in cadence with the tides below. And when Vigilant's instruments extended their reach across those oscillations, they did not return echoes of rock or hollow chambers, but cascades of resonance that felt like memory itself, an archive woven not in symbols, but in gravity. Jules was the first to say it aloud, her voice low as though naming the revelation too loudly might shatter it, explaining that each oscillation carried harmonic modulations that mirrored ancient seismographic events on Earth. Quakes cataloged centuries ago, tsunamis written into coastal myths, even tidal surges long forgotten by history, but preserved in oral tradition across islands. Rhea overlaid the signals against Earth's deep archive, and the match was undeniable, each pulse repeating with precision that could only come from intentional recording, as though the Phantom Moon had been watching Earth long before telescopes had existed, long before sails had cut oceans, long before language had risen to carry memory. The chamber of Vigilant fell silent as the crew absorbed the implication that the tides racking Earth were not random demonstrations of power, but the reawakening of an intelligence that spoke in the only language Earth had ever truly known: catastrophe written in water and stone. Mara closed her eyes and felt the weight of it pressing against her chest. Because if the Phantom Moon was alive, then it was not simply demanding acknowledgement, but insisting on recognition, urging humanity to remember that survival had always been born from calamity. Anika, her fingers tense against her console, whispered that the pulses were intensifying as if the intelligence had sensed their comprehension, adjusting its rhythm to sharpen meaning. Across Earth, the consequences grew sharper still. Cities on coastlines evacuated in panic, Aircraft rerouted around storm fronts that rose without precedent. Orbital habitats forced to shut down tethered elevators before oscillations could snap them like cords. The planet trembled in the presence of something vast, and still no consensus emerged among the nations below. Dr. Rhea turned toward Mara and said with quiet finality that this was not invasion, but remembrance, a trial drawn from humanity's own scars. And the question was no longer whether to destroy the Phantom Moon, but whether humanity could endure the memory it demanded them to confront. Mara's jaw tightened, her gaze locked on the luminous arcs curling across the impossible satellite, and she answered in words meant for every ear aboard. Then we will answer memory with choice. Section 7. Between Worship and War. The first fissure did not split through the Phantom Moon's surface, but through humanity itself, because even as Vigilant's crew mapped the pulses that carried memory, the governments and councils below were consumed by arguments that no consensus could calm. From the orbital chambers above Luna, ministers spoke with fervor that bordered on zeal, declaring that the Phantom Moon was not a threat but a gift, the long-awaited revelation of an intelligence beyond flesh that had chosen Earth as its pupil. They called the surging tides not disasters but lessons, proof that humanity was being tested, and entire populations on Earth began lighting fires on beaches and gathering in plazas, chanting that resistance was defiance against destiny. At the same hour, others shouted for bombardment, demanding the fleets ignite their arsenals before the tides grew strong enough to swallow cities outright. Admiral da Costa addressed the council in clipped tones, his voice a razor against the storm, reminding them that hesitation had already cost lives along the equatorial arcs where storms had torn through fragile grids, and that each pulse was sharpening as though measuring humanity's indecision. He insisted that the Phantom Moon must be treated as hostile until proven otherwise, that reverence was nothing more than surrender by another name. On Vigilance Bridge, Mara listened to the feeds with a heaviness that felt older than her bones, because every syllable rising from Earth was another stone laid across her shoulders, the weight of choice pressing toward fracture. Anika muttered that factions on Mars were already dispatching clandestine strike craft, unwilling to wait for authorization, while the Pan-Eurasian bloc had diverted entire relief fleets not to coastal evacuations, but to orbital ascension towers, where pilgrims demanded transport to the moon itself. Dr. Rhea spoke into the silence, her words calm, yet edged with fire, explaining that the Phantom Moon's pulses were adapting not only to natural phenomena, but to human response, as though it were listening, adjusting its rhythm according to fear, reverence, or defiance. "It is shaping us," she whispered, "the way a sculptor turns clay, and the shape will depend on whether we meet it with worship or with war." Mara drew a slow breath and steadied herself against the rail, her voice carrying across Vigilance deck with the quiet certainty of command. "Then we will not choose either path blindly. We will step into its silence and demand that it hear us on our terms." Section 8. Descent into the core. The chamber's floor opened into a funnel of descending light, a spiral of curving planes that folded downward like petals, each surface glowing faintly with geometric runes that pulsed in counterpoint to the team's heartbeats. Captain Solari led the way, her boots planting firmly on surfaces that reoriented beneath each step, gravity itself curving as though the Phantom Moon was reshaping its own rules to guide them further inward. Her voice, calm but taut with command, ordered tether lines maintained at all times, though everyone knew lines meant little when direction itself was unreliable. Rao muttered readings through the comm, his instruments trembling with interference, warning that the gravitational vectors below were stacked in layers like nested shells, and that if they fell into the wrong corridor, they might never find a path back. Dane steadied her breath as she followed, her gloved hand brushing along a ridge of polished alloy that shimmered as though alive, and in the faint hum she swore, she heard echoes of thought too faint to understand. "It feels like it's waiting," she whispered, though her words carried across the squad channel, prompting nervous silence that weighed heavier than the shifting gravity. Halfway down, the funnel widened into a cavern that looked less like an interior and more like a horizon folded inside out. A sea of luminous filaments drifting in great arcs across open void, suspended not by structures, but by forces invisible yet undeniable. The team's lights flickered uselessly against the radiance, casting shadows that bent in opposite directions. Rao explained in a strained voice that the filaments pulsed in harmonic resonance, storing and releasing gravitational energy like living conduits, and that each was connected to the deeper pulse they had tracked since entry. When the descent resumed, they reached an aperture shaped like an iris, its surface rippling with liquid metal that parted at their approach. Beyond it stretched the core, an inverted cathedral of colossal spires hanging downward into nothingness, each one etched with moving runes that formed and reformed like shifting constellations. Solari froze, her breath catching as she realized the patterns were not random, but linguistic, a script written in the grammar of forces themselves. Rao whispered with awe that they were standing inside the mind of the phantom moon, and that its language was gravity. In the silence that followed, the entire chamber pulsed once, a deep resonance that rattled bones and made visors fog. It was not just language anymore. It was acknowledgement. Section 9. The Shattered Consensus. News of the core's acknowledgement reached Earth at the same time storms rose along every coastline, because the phantom moon's tidal whispers had become declarations, dragging oceans into patterns no model could predict. Cities watch harbors climb their own seawalls, rivers reverse their flow, and storms form over deserts that had not seen rain in years, all of it timed to the pulse of the orbiting giant. Scientists called it evidence of comprehension, as if the structure above had chosen to announce itself through oceans rather than words. But governments called it coercion, and within hours the Council's emergency session fractured into a storm of its own. The orbital assembly that should have been unity became a theater of rivalry. The Pan-Eurasian bloc urged immediate bombardment, declaring that survival meant swift destruction before the tides became uninhabitable. The North Atlantic Alliance threatened sanctions against any ship that acted without consensus, fearing that the implosion might prove worse than inaction. The Terran Collective, swayed by voices who saw in the Phantom Moon a cathedral rather than a weapon, demanded that no shot be fired at all, insisting humanity was being offered guardianship rather than extinction. Every sentence spoken in one bloc's defense was heard by another as betrayal, and no two commanders agreed whether the structure was miracle, trap, or final judgment. Within the inverted cathedral, Captain Dane heard the arguments cascade through secure channels, each one louder than the last, and realized that paralysis had become as lethal as violence. She ordered the shuttle to hold position and transmitted a single truth across all frequencies. The core had responded. Dr. Rian expanded, his voice measured, explaining that its harmonics proved understanding, and that destroying the Phantom Moon outright would collapse its mirrored mantle inward, translating all that stored gravitational tension into an implosion vast enough to scour continents from the map. But before his warning could settle, someone fired. A tungsten spear, launched in defiance of hesitation, streaked across the dark like a star freed from orbit. The atrium did not shatter, nor did the projectile strike its hull. Instead, the chamber inhaled, bending space-time itself. The spear curled into an elegant loop, momentum folded into orbit, and what had been a weapon became a useless arc of light circling like an ornament, its futility visible to every fleet and every capital. Solari demanded again what the intelligence intended, and the chamber brightened with visions so ancient they felt like weather. Storms tamed, oceans shielded, continents shepherded across centuries of cataclysm. Then came the sentence, clear in every mind. Guardianship required consent, spoken with one voice. Dane carried that message into the fractured council, urging that survival, now, demanded unanimity measured, not in treaties, but in physics. The vote began as the phantom moon pulsed once more, a soundless demand that humanity either speak together or not at all. Section 10. Fire on the horizon. The Council's vote fractured not along national borders, but along the fault lines of fear and faith. And when the results bled across encrypted channels, the numbers offered no clarity, only chaos dressed in statistics. Nearly half supported bombardment, swearing that hesitation would drown coastlines and crush cities before diplomacy found breath. The others demanded restraint, convinced that destruction would tear Earth apart as surely as surrender. In the silence between announcements, fleets positioned themselves like knives hovering above the table, waiting for the smallest movement to decide which blade fell first. On the Vigilance command deck, Captain Dane stood between factions embodied in her own crew, because Solari whispered that the Phantom Moon was reaching out for covenant rather than conquest, while Rian spat that trust was suicide disguised as curiosity. Their debate did not end in words, but in the tremor that passed through every panel, because the moon itself had pulsed again, this time harder, dragging tides high enough to swallow ports and fracture levees across 3 continents. Reports streamed in, lives measured in thousands already drowned or displaced, and for the first time in hours, Dane's hand shook as she gripped the rail. Earth's skies burned with streaks of fire before any official order was given. A splinter block, furious at indecision, had launched a covert strike. A cluster of nuclear-tipped lances designed to gouge the Phantom Moon's mantle and scatter its remains into manageable ruin. The missiles climbed out of atmosphere like desperate prayers, their contrails etched into dawn across nations, still screaming for consensus. And every ship in orbit knew the war had begun whether they endorsed it or not. The Phantom Moon did not absorb this volley as it had the tungsten spear. It reflected, space around it bent, scattering warheads back across the void, some flung harmlessly into the outer dark, others redirected into the planet's upper atmosphere, where they burst into auroras of ruin. Civilian satellites vaporized, orbital platforms staggered under cascading shocks, and still the moon pulsed again, louder, its demand vibrating through hulls, through oceans, through marrow. Consent, it repeated. One voice, one decision. In that moment, Dane understood that the Phantom Moon was not demanding reverence but coherence, and that the greatest danger was not its pulse but humanity's refusal to stand together beneath it. She ordered the fleet into defensive posture, shielding what they could, even as fire spread across the horizon of Earth below, a horizon lit not only by the reflected glow of failed weapons, but by the dawning realization that the battle ahead would be decided not by technology, but by unity. Section 11. The Last Accord. The fires still burned in the upper atmosphere when the emergency conclave convened, not in a chamber of marble or metal, but across the trembling bandwidth of every fleet, colony, and council node that remained unbroken by the Phantom Moon's reflection. There were no speeches this time, only exhaustion and the raw edge of desperation, because every leader had seen what defiance alone invited, and every commander knew that hesitation was indistinguishable from surrender. Admiral Kalen's face appeared grainy against Vigilance Holidable. His usual iron-cast composure softened into lines of fatigue, and he said simply that humanity had one last chance to answer with one voice rather than many. Arguments sputtered at first, reflexes sharpened by months of factional dispute, but as the feed filled with images of drowned cities, ruined satellites, and burning skies, silence spread like gravity. Minister Halbrecht, once the loudest advocate of restraint, admitted with hollow eyes that restraint had become indistinguishable from death, while Solari's voice trembled as she countered that total war would unravel Earth itself if the moon collapsed under nuclear fire. Into that silence, Dane stepped, not as captain of Vigilant, but as witness to the dying equilibrium of a planet. She said that the phantom moon demanded coherence, not obedience, and that the only chance they had was to present one decision, whether war or dialogue, delivered without fracture. Dr. Anwin added weight with numbers that could not be softened. Simulations showed that the moon's harmonics were approaching resonance with Earth's core, and within days the crust would fracture into quakes capable of swallowing nations whole. They did not have weeks or months to stall. They had hours, perhaps less. Her conclusion was brutal but clear. A decision made together, even the wrong decision, might preserve survival better than fractured brilliance. The vote came, and for the first time since the phantom moon appeared, unanimity was achieved. Humanity would attempt neither worship nor blind annihilation, but intervention. A direct insertion into the core to stabilize the harmonics, to speak not with weapons or sermons, but with presence. It was a decision so reckless it bordered on myth. Yet for once no one raised objection. Orders spread across the fleets, aligning task groups into one formation. Escorts shielding the strike craft that would descend into the moon's inverted cathedral. For the first time, the phantom moon pulsed not in command, but in recognition, as though it had felt humanity's single note rise above the discord. Dane looked across her bridge, her crew battered yet unbroken, and she whispered the words she had not dared speak until now. Prepare to enter. Section 12. The Phantom's Choice. The strike vessels crossed the event horizon of the phantom moon's skin, not with fire, but with trembling light, their hulls bathed in auroral currents that refracted into corridors wider than oceans, until space itself felt less like void than like breath held too long. Dane's voice steadied her crew, though her hands tightened on the rail, ordering thrusters cut to minimum, allowing the moon's own gravity wells to draw them deeper into the cathedral of inverted arcs where rivers of molten light flowed upward instead of down. The silence was unbearable until the first harmonic wave struck, not as attack, but as recognition, the moon acknowledging their entry like an organ recognizing a foreign pulse. Dr. Anwin's instruments screamed with overlapping frequencies, graphs splintering into unreadable spectrums until she realized the data was not chaos, but invitation, gravitational equations reshaped into syllables of a language older than Earth's tides. The moon was speaking, not in threat, but in proof, showing them what it was, a memory of civilizations lost to silence, each having faced the same choice between annihilation and understanding, each having etched its decision into the lattice now humming around them. Dane whispered that humanity was only the latest petitioners in a dialogue spanning eons, and the only measure that mattered was coherence. Commander Solari's hand hovered above the arming panel, her instincts crying for violence. But Dane stopped her with one word: wait. They funneled the harmonics captured by Anwin into the ship's mass projectors, sculpting a single resonant pulse that carried not equations, but humanity's choice. Survival without surrender, defiance without erasure, the insistence that life mattered even if flawed, fractured, and fleeting. The pulse rippled outward, a fragile note against the cathedral's thunder, and for a heartbeat nothing returned but silence, so complete it threatened to collapse courage itself. Then the moon answered, its lattice shifting with a resonance that bent clouds across Earth's skies into spirals visible to every soul who looked upward that night. Tides steadied, storms eased, quakes stilled as the moon pulled its harmonics into retreat. Not departure, but dormancy, as though humanity's defiant coherence had satisfied a test it had not known it was taking. Dane's breath shuddered as she gave the final order: withdraw. Engines flared, drawing the strike vessels back into open void where Earth turned beneath them, scarred but alive. No one cheered. There was only silence and the knowledge that they had been measured by a power older than nations. And for this moment, found sufficient. The phantom moon still hung in the heavens, pale and inscrutable, but no longer pressing its weight upon Earth. Humanity had survived not by conquest nor submission, but by unity, proof that even in fracture, its voice could hold. The question of when the moon might wake again lingered, unspoken, yet Dane's final thought echoed in every heart. History had been written this day, not by the phantom above, but by humanity's refusal to yield. Please do press that like button if you have enjoyed this story, and also please do subscribe and hit the bell icon to listen to more stories like this one. That would mean a real lot to me. Now go ahead and listen to your next story here.